Welcome to AMSEcast, coming to you from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a global leader in science, technology, and innovation. My name is Alan Lowe, Director of the American Museum of Science and Energy and the K25 History Center. Each episode of AMSEcast presents world-renowned authors, scientists, historians, policymakers, and everyone in between, sharing their insights on a variety of fascinating topics. Welcome to AMSEcast. It's a real honor and pleasure to welcome our guest today, Charles Oppenheimer. I was very pleased to meet Charles at last year's Nuclear Opportunity Workshop in Knoxville, Tennessee, sponsored as always by the East Tennessee Economic Council. I learned there that after spending several years in Silicon Valley as well as undertaking investments in social projects in sub-Saharan Africa, Charles had formed both the Oppenheimer Project and Oppenheimer Energy. Carrying on the legacy of his grandfather, J. Robert Oppenheimer, Charles is now a major force in vitally important discussions of the benefits of nuclear energy, the dangers of nuclear proliferation, and the need for nuclear arms control. He's going to talk with us today about his current work, and we'll ask a few questions about a pretty famous movie from 2023 that bears his last name as we end the interview. So Charles, thanks for joining us in AMSEcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure, sir. Let's start with the Oppenheimer Project. I've been so impressed with what I've learned about what you're doing. Can you tell us what that is and what your mission is?
What it generally is our family-based representation of Robert Oppenheimer, his values and thoughts and how they could impact the world most positively, and mainly focused on fission energy, which of course Robert Oppenheimer at this point is synonymous with. So pursuing kind of his advice and policies on how more cooperation around controlling fission could cause great benefits from the science. And the opposite of not cooperation could cause arms race and great danger. So it came about inspired by the Department of Energy setting up a Oppenheimer Science and Leadership program, which is a great program within the Department of Energy. And when they had reached out to the family and asked for permission, that spawned the idea of why doesn't our family have our own representation of Robert Oppenheimer? So it started that as a nonprofit. We call it a project, not a foundation, because we invite a lot of people in. We have donors from different areas, including our family and employees. It's not all family members. And the idea is to, grow the platform and the voice and the values of Robert Oppenheimer.
So in terms of the specific things on that platform, I know I sat in the other day on a really interesting discussion about arms control and the START Treaty at the Stimson Center. What kind of projects are within the Oppenheimer Project?
Yeah, just two little minor things of stopping nuclear war and stopping climate change, right? Is our
and what do you do after lunch, Charles?
Yeah, that's just a small items, but we really do think they're controlled. So we try to sometimes put it in measurable goals. There's about 10,000 nuclear weapons in the world, and there's about 450 nuclear power plants. So if we could shift that equation on either side, increase the amount of nuclear good, which is not just power plants, it's also medicine and food uses, but we focus a little more on power. We think that's a net benefit for the world, so that can be focused on just on its own. We have a particular focus of trying to bring in climate philanthropists and those who are interested in climate philanthropy and promoting energy abundance and had not considered nuclear energy, and kind of having an open dialogue with them. And then on the nuclear risk reduction, the general focus is trying to follow the philosophy more than anything else of Robert Oppenheimer, Niels Bohr, and the other scientists who kind of saw at the time that we were making the nuclear weapons during war that there would be a period after war where we would be tempted to go into an arms race, and the only possible safety from arms races from nuclear weapons is increased cooperation, particularly on fissionable material. So if you put all those together, you say, well, we really have to do the same thing. We have to cooperate on fissionable material internationally, and we can choose to make more energy out of that. If we're cooperating, we can make sure we're making energy, not bombs. So we, kind of view those two goals together, although sometimes traditionally they were really kept separate. You had the part camp who was anti-nuclear weapons, and then they often became anti-nuclear energy and power. And you had the pro-power and energy people and said, well, I don't have time to think about nuclear weapons. That's not my area. And so we're trying to have the conversation together.
When you're talking about the benefits of nuclear energy, are you primarily looking in terms of climate? Are you looking in terms of need for AI, that type of thing, or is it a mix of all the above?
Well, I started the thought with kind of derived from the climate conversation. I actually remembered this a little that my original seed was reading in Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, and he was talking. It's a good book generally, but he was talking about, we have these potential climate threats, but there's solutions to it that include a massive amount of more energy. And if we need a ton more energy, nuclear energies, that began my thought of like, well, if climate change is a problem, could we have a Manhattan Project type solution, something that really solves it by a massive amount more energy? Since my initial foray that's piqued my interest, I think we've gotten a lot more interested in just general energy abundance, whether climate change is your focus or eradication of poverty, the expansion of a huge amount of additional energy instead of conserving energy, which was the older environmental method. Let's conserve energy, spend less, and we can get to safety. I think we've proven that doesn't work. Nobody saved any energy. We burn more energy than ever. And I would make the argument that most places in the world that don't have enough energy should have more. So I'm kind of dual mission on just energy abundance, whether it's climate change perspective or poverty, economy, it all works.
I've read that you were working with emerging economies and so forth in terms of their adoption, perhaps of nuclear energy. What are the steps to make that happen, both here and in those emerging economies? Because I know there are limitations, there are obstacles to getting from here to there in a nuclear energy economy.
Yeah, they're both difficult. If you look at United States has, real challenges increasing nuclear power as measured by the amount of new nuclear power we have. We have 2.2 gigawatts of new projects coming online in the last 40 years. So we've had a real challenge. And in the US, it's not a lack of money or resources, a lack of allocation to nuclear energy. And people were not willing to make that choice. So we have challenges in developed economies. If you look at emerging economies, a lot of times that's added on to the challenges where, a lot of these economies can't access any nuclear power because they don't have the resources to even start the process, and they have a lot of limitations. One thing we always like to try to bring up is the non-proliferation treaty that is really focused on controlling nuclear risks has as a core tenet that these countries without nuclear power are giving up their pursuit of nuclear weapons, and the payback is supposed to be that those countries with nuclear weapons is supposed to help the countries without nuclear weapons get nuclear energy, and that we've contractually agreed to that. But just like many things in the developing world, there's all types of challenges. There's not enough money, not enough resources, and then there's specific concerns that typically the United States and other countries would say, well, here's the 50 things you have to do to make nuclear energy safe, and the newcomer countries, as they're called, aren't able to get through the steps. So that's a really great place for philanthropic effort. You need more resources than these countries can get.
That was my next question of how when you talk to those countries or people here thinking about investing in this, and they ask questions about safety, about waste, about proliferation, how do you answer those? Where are the resources that can be brought to the table to help answer those questions?
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a discussion about this with an investor group yesterday, and this particular investor started off with saying, well, the problem with nuclear power is that, it's dangerous and there's radiation and everybody hates it. And I said, well, that's not my perspective. I used to think that, but I actually have seen the data that says that people who live around nuclear energy power plants love it. They have the highest favorability rating of any area. It's sometimes over 70, 80, 90% of people who live. And that's directly opposite of what this investor had heard. He heard that nobody wants a nuclear power plant in your backyard. And I said, well, that's not actually true. The people who have it in their backyard want more. So that's an example of how difficult it is to get through these conversations. I maybe I'll get you to restate or refresh the other part of the question, but that's the type of conversation you have to have here, and you have to have it in other places. There's this uh, ambient perception of how dangerous and terrible nuclear is, and I often try to simplify it and say people are way too afraid of nuclear power, which has had no radiation injuries in its from operating plants in the United States for its entire history. That's amazing. If
Yeah.
you thought something was dangerous and you tested it for 70 years and you didn't have a single injury, you would say, "Wow, there's nothing safer in the world." That's the facts and the data, and the perception is off the chart danger. And I think that derives from nuclear weapons. It's a conception in our mind that nuclear power plant is probably the same thing as a bomb. It can kill us all. And I would add to that counterintuitively that people aren't afraid enough of nuclear weapons. So I guess I have a lot of complaints. We should be more scared of nuclear weapons and way less scared of nuclear power.
I think we did a series last year. I want to continue it. We have a sci-fi movie series, and you can see in popular culture, in the 50s in particular, where you start seeing this kind of overblown approach to the potential dangers of nuclear energy and so forth. And we had a whole Godzilla thing and all that
Yeah,
over time. Now, of course, some of that was from nuclear weapons in the movies, but it's
sure.
interesting how it entered popular culture in a way too that was detrimental. And when we're here in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, as you know, this is a community very friendly to nuclear. But when you step outside of here, it's a big educational effort. Big part of
That's
what
right.
we do is exactly what you're doing on a larger scale. So I know you work with various groups. I saw you work with the IAEA and others. So when you go out into those, say, non-investor kind of public environments where people aren't used to nuclear, how are you pitching it? How are you saying this is something you should consider and not be scared of?
Yeah, it is a good delineation because the expert communities, the scientists, people in Oak Ridge, the more familiarity you have with nuclear science and the facts, the more comfortable you are with it. IAEA is a good example of one of those rare institutions that have the same goals as us, more, reduce nuclear risk and increase nuclear benefits and power. So that's an example of kind of the choir that you're preaching to. Outside of that, the traditional the situation with the nuclear power industry was very much on a defensive basis, right? Because there was such bad press and people were so worried about it. And if you were running a business in this space, you'd say, well, it's not worth the risk talking about nuclear energy. And I've come to it kind of late in the game, and I see that nuclear energy has already increased polling in the United States to be favorable. It's politically very favorable on the federal level. They pass. So I don't really like to beat around the bush. So instead of saying, well, you have some very valid concerns and I want to confirm your fears, I often just say, I don't think nuclear power is dangerous, and I don't think the radiation has injured anybody, and I don't think the waste is a problem, and I'm willing to just dive right in and talk about it. Now, how effective that is when you just, instead of apologizing for it, just say, this is the way I see it. Um, I think it's been well received, especially because I do usually couch on it in terms of this is something that I've changed my mind on. I used to have the ambient misunderstanding, and it's only once I looked at the facts and the data and talked to scientists did I change my mind about it. And if you put those together, I hope it helps. And what I try to do, like this investor group, is talk to places that are outside of the nuclear bubble chamber because you find everybody agrees in that. Can you get the message outside to the general population?
So when I first came to Oak Ridge, which has now been 6 years ago, and the discussion of nuclear was happening, one of the questions was, will we have investors? There's a lot of money to go into this. Now it's every day there's a new nuclear project coming to Oak Ridge. This seems like the investment world is opening up definitely to this scenario. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's been just a really wild change in investor appetite. A little bit last year, end of 2025, I was in a conference in London, and one of the bankers there said it's impossible to overstate the demand for nuclear investments in the public market, right? So that was a little moment in the time where it had been building up, and all these institutional investors, everybody who buys stock, who has a portfolio and a mutual fund, wanted to say, how can I buy into nuclear? Because it seems like the future. Now, public markets go up and down and change really fast. You get bubbles and stuff. So there's certain areas of the capital markets that are been more conducive to nuclear, and other ones that are harder. And the ones that are harder is the kind of financing that really builds projects. That's harder to come by. So what you see is this type of capital that can start a nuclear project, like a reactor experiment within a lab that can start the process. You have venture capital that can start a startup. But when you go to deploy a nuclear project, it takes billions and billions of dollars. And those investors are always, they have billions of dollars, and they're looking at, what is my return from this asset compared to anywhere else I can put my money, and and they're, it's that institutional capital has been scarce. And if you measure the number of actual projects we have in the United States that are designed to produce nuclear power on the grid with an approved reactor, unfortunately, it's still at zero. So you look around the world, there's about 70, 80 real projects. In the United States, there's a couple of them that are close, so close that they're almost there. They're just missing that final certification, but they're not as far advanced as typically as about 70 or 80 of the kind of real projects around the world. And that's continued to be a real challenge, getting real projects on the board.
I want to make sure we have time to talk a bit more about your work with proliferation and arms control. Perhaps can you tell me some of the initiatives there of how you're trying to get your voice out on those issues?
Yeah, well, that term is probably the main thing, voice. So, what can you do with these issues? It's such a big issue. Are we going to have less nuclear weapons in the world? And it's something that's so powerful, not even a president of a country like United States can decide on it. It takes a group effort, and it traditionally haven't had a voice from just general people who are not politicians. So one thing I do is talk and write about it and share my grandfather's philosophy. And I think that's the most important part, really, is that there is an actual answer to these threats. And I believe that it's kind of a first principle of the threat of nuclear weapons. And looking back at those instead of the kind of political situation right now or the specific policy decisions, that's my main motivation, is sharing what are the philosophical roots of safety from nuclear weapons. And it all comes down to scientific cooperation, recognizing that you cannot have a monopoly around a dangerous science or technology because the other side can just figure that out and do it, and there's no safety. So tactically, that's become, writing, talking, joining, having partnerships with things like IAEA. I do have this long shot mission that I'd like help with from anybody who can think how. So the summary of the policy advice of my grandfather was to have the countries with the most nuclear weapons and capability at the time collaborate and reduce, kind of share risk. And that didn't happen. We got into an arms race with the Soviet Union instead of collaborating with them. So I just think that that's still the thing that has to happen to reduce risk. So right now, today, it would be trilateral talks between US, China, and Russia. And as a private citizen, you can't do everything to bring leaders of the countries, but you can try to influence and promote the idea. And that's kind of the highest order goal of the organization. Can we promote trilateral dialogue and about those weapons risks?
Again, the program the other day, again, was very fascinating. I look forward to hearing more about that and seeing as you make progress in that, hopefully around the world. I want to step back just for a moment. I realized I didn't ask you specifically about Oppenheimer Energy. How does that work within the Oppenheimer Project or beside Oppenheimer Project with your work in nuclear?
Yeah, so Oppenheimer Project's a nonprofit, as I mentioned, and has this mission. Now, I'm a entrepreneur, businessman, Silicon Valley type, and so when I see a problem, I want to create a business to solve the problem, not just a nonprofit. And the mission, I would say, is kind of like the top level is Oppenheimer Project of less weapons and more energy, more nuclear power plants. And then if you say, how do we actually achieve this? I looked for business tools. And so I started Oppenheimer Energy as a solution to try to achieve the biggest problems I saw in nuclear power sector, which was not the creation of new reactors. It's not the physics. It's not the operation of reactors. It's not the safety and efficacy. It really is around the finance and project risk. Can we make it viable to build new nuclear and get a financial return? If we can make that the case, we can get way, way more money and energy coming out of the nuclear sector than we currently can. So that's the focus of Oppenheimer Energy is reducing the finance and project risk with something we call a nuclear developer model.
So such important work you're doing on all fronts. I want to turn now to a movie you may have heard of, Oppenheimer.
Yes.
I always joke, Charles, that when the movie came out, we had a little premiere here in Oak Ridge. It was great, a great night, and our visitation went up so much. I said we need, an Oppenheimer sequel or something here. We need every year for our visitation.
I've been working on Oppenheimer 3.
Oh, very
So
good. Thank you. Wonderful. But it's music to my heart. So let me ask you, when they made the movie, did they consult with you? Did they consult with the family?
not exactly consult, so it was the movie was based on American Prometheus, and American Prometheus is, a biography. And so those authors, of course, had interviewed some people in the family.
I know Cillian Murphy is a wonderful actor. I wondered, again, I'm not asking you to be a movie critic, but from your personal viewpoint, what did you think of his portrayal of your grandfather?
I think he did a good job. That's the type of thing where the closer to the subject you are, the harder it is. So, my father and Michael Oppenheimer, who knew Robert Oppenheimer, for them, it's really hard to see an actor portraying somebody you personally know. I sometimes describe this as imagine if some actress was playing your mother and, they got every fact right, where she went to school and her friends and stuff, but it would still be kind of horrifying to you. It's not your mother. It's totally wrong. And so I didn't really have that reaction because I didn't meet my grandfather in person. I think Killian did a good job. The movie was great. He won an Oscar. When I walked on set the first time, he saw me and Michael Oppenheimer, who's Robert Oppenheimer's nephew, my dad's cousin, and he was just kind of shocked and said, "Wow, this is weird," because you spend all your time studying somebody, and it was like, I'm not Robert Oppenheimer, but I'm more related to him than Killian was, so that was kind of funny.
So Cillian Murphy starstruck with you. I like that.
That's right. I'd like to think. But Killian's just a person. That's one thing. Being affiliated with famous people my whole life, people have this myth of like a famous person is so different and stuff. I know we're all just people, and movie stars are. So it was good to just sit there and talk to him and chat. And on either side, he's doing his job, working all day, and I was showing up watching it. That was the context of it.
That's fascinating. I wonder if you saw anything in the movie that perhaps you'd heard from your family about your grandfather that maybe the movie gave you a little glimpse of that you maybe wished it had done more about, that the audience could have learned more about your grandfather.
I had suggested to Chris Nolan when I first talked to him, I think he should make the thread of the movie related to the Bhagavad Gita as kind of a spiritual transformation, and then kind of dealing with, he wasn't a Hindu by any sense, but he was a philosopher. He read everything, and that really shaped his form. So I thought that would have been a good literary framework. I'm kind of a scholar of what Robert Oppenheimer did, and I read all the books. And so the interesting thing about the movie is it shortened down stuff from many, many years into a way that people could consume and be entertained by it. And I think they did a good job generally keeping it in line, changing some things for dramatic purposes that Nolan thought would make a better story, but generally had this really dense history that some of us who know a lot about it could watch and agree with. And if you knew nothing about Oppenheimer, you could also watch and go along with the story. Yeah.
So as you've been that student through the years, as you may see behind me, many, many books,
Yes.
Charles, are there specific works that you would say you need to reference this book to learn more about that era or your grandfather?
Well, I'll start with the grandfather one. So the family has kind of official recommendations, which come from my father, who obviously knew my dad more and is very has a very discerning taste for anything written about his father. He doesn't like anything that's like not 100% factual. So anyway, we always recommend the Letters and Recollections of J. Robert Oppenheimer because that's letters that he wrote. It's nobody else's interpretation. The editors did a great job. So if you really want to know who the person was, or kind of read his letters, that book. We like The Day After Trinity by John Else, and I recommend that over the Oppenheimer movie. Watch that. It's an hour instead of 3 hours. It's a documentary, and it'll be a lot closer to the truth than a fictional version. And finally, The Making of the Atomic Bomb. That's if you're a real nerd, by Richard Rhodes. But that one is a real masterpiece of what happened in World War II. And it's not focused on Oppenheimer at all, but it's such a valid one. So those are my three highest recommendations.
The letters, I know I was an archivist for many years. We called that type of thing the raw material of history. If you want to really learn, go to that. And I would say Richard Rhodes is a great friend of this museum. He's on our National Advisory Committee. I worked my way through The Making of the Atomic Bomb, and that's you learn a lot reading that book. It took me a while, but I really enjoyed it. And
I need to go back and read it. I think I was in college, and it's so dense. Yes. I noticed that, closer you are to a scientist or an engineer, the more you enjoy that version. It's really, Richard Rhodes is an amazing author.
My copy finally fell apart. I had to get a new edition. So Thank you, Charles. Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation, for all you're doing. Come see us soon in Oak Ridge again.
Okay, I'd love to.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of AMSEcast. For more information on this topic or any others, you can always visit us at amse.org or find, like, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I invite you to visit the American Museum of Science and Energy and the K25 History Center in person. You can also shop at our online store and become a member at amse.org. Thanks to our production team and Matt Mullins, plus our supportive colleagues at the Department of Energy's Office of Science, Office of Environmental Management, and Office of Legacy Management, as well as Oak Ridge National Laboratory, the Y-12 National Security Complex, NNSA, and the AMSE Foundation. And of course, thanks to our wonderful guests today and to all of you for listening. I hope you'll join us for the next episode of AMSEcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I would like to ask that you consider becoming a member of the 117 Society, the newest membership opportunity offered by the American Museum of Science and Energy Foundation. By joining the 117 Society, you will help us continue this podcast and our other innovative programming. You will support the expansion of our vitally important educational outreach, including virtual classes, and you will help ensure that both the American Museum of Science and Energy and the K25 History Center can continue to provide world-class exhibits to our community and to the world. Benefits of membership include special access to video and audio content and 117 Society merchandise, as well as all the benefits of our Atom Splitter membership level. To learn more, go to amse.org. The 117 Society is vital to the future of AMSE and the K25 History Center. I hope you will consider joining, and thank you very much.